Albany County, Wyoming Territory, October 1883. Wind cut across the prairie at 25 miles per hour as every homesteader raced to build standard rectangular cabins before winter, 16 by 20 feet with 6-inch log walls. John Grady was constructing something his neighbors had never seen, a U-shaped structure 40 feet across the opening, with walls 18 inches thick, double the wood, triple the time. Bill Morrison called it wasteful. The Kowalski brothers calculated he was using 40% more lumber than necessary. Local carpenter Sam Torres dismissed it as a fort missing its front wall. Grady, a former Army quartermaster who'd studied Pueblo building techniques in New Mexico, kept working by lantern light while others finished in 3 weeks. Then, January 15th, 1884 arrived. The death winter hit Wyoming with 35 below temperatures and 40-mile-per-hour winds. Standard cabins froze. Families huddled around failing stoves. But Grady's wasteful design created a tropical pocket where people worked outside in light clothing while thermometers read 20 below. What did he understand about heat and survival that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. October winds swept across Albany County, Wyoming Territory, carrying the bite of early winter and the urgency that drove every homesteader to finish construction before the killing cold arrived. The year 1883 had brought another wave of settlers to this high plains country, where survival depended on building fast and building smart, or so conventional wisdom dictated. Most newcomers followed the same proven formula: stake out a rectangular plot, fell enough timber for a 16 by 20 foot cabin, and race against time to get walls up and a roof over their heads before November storms made outdoor work impossible. John Grady walked a different pattern across his 160-acre claim that October morning, his surveyors chain-marking boundaries that made no sense to anyone watching. Instead of the standard rectangular footprint his neighbors expected, Grady paced out a U-shaped design 40 feet across at the opening, with two 28-foot wings extending north. The opening faced due south, directly into Wyoming's notorious wind corridor, a choice that defied every piece of frontier building advice ever passed down from experienced homesteaders. Bill Morrison, whose own cabin foundation lay squared and ready for construction just a quarter-mile east, rode over to watch Grady surveying with growing bewilderment. Morrison had successfully homesteaded in eastern Colorado, where standard frontier construction had served him well through several winters. The sight of Grady's peculiar layout struck him as the work of someone who'd never built a proper shelter in harsh country. Why is he building a stable without a roof? Morrison wondered aloud to his wife that evening, shaking his head at what he'd witnessed. The question carried more than mere curiosity. It reflected the deep skepticism that ran through farming communities when someone deviated from time-tested methods. By the time Grady began felling timber, his construction plans had become neighborhood entertainment. The Kowalski brothers, Stephen and Joseph, had arrived from Pennsylvania coal country with industrial experience in quick, economical building. They watched Grady select trees and calculated that his design would consume 40% more logs than necessary for equivalent shelter space. Their mining camp background had taught them to measure every board foot against survival value, and Grady's approach failed their cost-efficiency test. Olaf Henriksen, the Norwegian immigrant whose own cabin site lay marked and ready for traditional construction, brought old-world experience to his judgment of Grady's methods. Henriksen had grown up building in Arctic conditions around Trondheim, but even his Nordic sensibilities couldn't make sense of what appeared to be an enormous waste of good lumber. The design looked like something a man might attempt if he had unlimited time and resources, luxuries no Wyoming homesteader could afford. Sam Torres, Albany County's primary carpenter and the closest thing to professional building authority within 50 miles, delivered the most damning assessment when he examined Grady's foundation work. Torres had successfully constructed dozens of frontier cabins using proven territorial building standards, and his professional reputation rested on delivering solid shelter quickly and economically. Looking at Grady's foundation layout, Torres pronounced it a fort missing its front wall, professional shorthand for a design that violated basic principles of protection and efficiency. The conventional wisdom that guided Torres and every other experienced builder in Wyoming Territory had evolved through decades of trial and error on the frontier. Proper cabins measured 16 by 20 feet as standard, providing 320 square feet of living space that could be heated efficiently with a single fireplace or stove. Walls should be 6 to 8 inches thick, built from single logs chinked with mud and moss, because thicker construction wasted materials without providing proportional benefits. The narrow end of the cabin should face south to minimize wind exposure, and windows should be kept small and few to prevent heat loss. Most critically, construction should be completed within 3 weeks of breaking ground, because Wyoming weather could turn lethal without warning after mid-October. Grady's design violated every one of these established principles. His walls rose 18 inches thick using double log construction with sawdust insulation packed between inner and outer layers. The U-shaped structure would encompass 950 square feet of main living space, plus a 500 square foot courtyard completely enclosed on 3 sides. The 20-foot wide south-facing opening had no barrier whatsoever, creating what appeared to be a gaping vulnerability to winter storms. Interior walls were being lined with locally quarried sandstone, adding weight and complexity that served no obvious purpose to frontier minds focused on basic shelter. The construction timeline alone marked Grady as either inexperienced or reckless. While his neighbors completed their cabins in the standard 3-week period, Grady's project stretched into November, requiring work by lantern light when daylight hours shortened. The extended timeline wasn't merely inconvenient, it was dangerous, as late-season storms could trap a builder with an incomplete roof or unfinished walls. What his neighbors couldn't understand was that John Grady brought knowledge they lacked. His 6 years as U.S. Army quartermaster at Fort Wingate, New Mexico Territory, had required him to document Native American construction techniques for potential military adoption. His official reports contained detailed observations of Pueblo Indian passive solar design principles, including courtyard orientation that captured winter sunlight, thermal mass applications using stone and adobe, and wind shadow utilization that created comfortable microclimates in high-altitude desert conditions. Grady had measured and documented buildings that kept their inhabitants comfortable through mountain winters using no fuel except carefully managed solar gain and thermal mass storage. He'd recorded temperature differentials and fuel consumption rates that proved traditional techniques could outperform standard frontier construction by significant margins. But this technical knowledge meant nothing to Wyoming neighbors who judged building methods by speed of construction and conformity to proven local practices. When Morrison confronted Grady directly about his unusual methods, asking why he was risking his family's safety on an untested design, Grady attempted to explain the principles behind his approach. He described how the U-shape would catch the sun and hold the warmth, how thermal mass would store solar heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. His explanations about wind shadows and convection control sounded like theoretical nonsense to practical frontier minds who trusted what they could see working in neighbors' cabins. The mockery intensified as Grady's construction dragged through November, while his neighbors moved into completed, warm cabins. The community pressure to abandon his experiment and build something conventional grew with each freezing morning, but Grady continued laying stone and packing sawdust insulation with the methodical persistence of someone following documented procedures rather than improvising solutions. December arrived in Wyoming, territory with the sudden violence that marked high plains weather, dropping temperatures from autumn's mild 50s to winter's brutal teens in the span of 3 days. The first serious cold snap of 1883 caught most homesteaders still adjusting to their new cabins, learning how much fuel their hastily built structures would demand through the long months ahead. John Grady moved into his completed fortress on December 3rd, just as the mercury began its relentless descent toward temperatures that would test every building decision made during the frantic construction season. The contrast became apparent within hours. While his neighbors fired their stoves continuously to maintain interior temperatures hovering between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Grady's cabin held steady at 65 degrees with what appeared to be minimal wood consumption. Bill Morrison, wrestling with a stove that seemed to devour cordwood without producing adequate heat, began paying attention to the thin wisps of smoke rising from Grady's chimney compared to the thick, constant columns pouring from every other homestead in the valley. The most mysterious phenomenon revealed itself in Grady's courtyard, where snow refused to accumulate despite steady precipitation that piled drifts 3 feet deep against conventional cabin walls throughout the territory. While neighbors struggled to keep paths clear from their doors to their woodpiles, Grady's 20 by 25-foot courtyard remained remarkably clear of snow, the ground visible and apparently unfrozen even as temperatures dropped into single digits. The mechanism behind these seemingly impossible conditions lay in the sophisticated physics of Grady's U-shaped design, though his neighbors understood none of the principles at work. The north and west walls, rising 18 inches thick with their sawdust insulation, functioned as massive wind barriers that blocked Wyoming's prevailing winds, which averaged 25 to 30 miles per hour during winter months. The east wall deflected morning wind gusts around the protected courtyard space, creating what meteorologists would later recognize as a classic wind shadow effect. Most critically, the 20-foot southern opening captured low-angle winter sunlight with remarkable efficiency. In December, when the sun traced its lowest arc across the Wyoming sky at only 26 degrees above the horizon, Grady's courtyard design funneled in concentrated solar radiation that would have been lost or scattered by conventional rectangular construction. The sandstone lining the interior walls absorbed this solar energy throughout the day, storing heat in thermal mass that released its warmth slowly through the frigid nights. The still air trapped within the courtyard created a microclimate that defied exterior conditions, while wind howled across the exposed prairie at speeds that drove wind chill factors toward life-threatening extremes. The protected space within Grady's U-shaped walls maintained an environment 15 to 20 degrees warmer than ambient temperature. This differential meant that when morning temperatures outside read 10 degrees below zero, conditions within the courtyard hovered near 10 degrees above zero, the difference between flesh-freezing exposure and merely uncomfortable cold. By mid-December, the evidence of Grady's success had become impossible for neighbors to ignore. Each morning, as they emerged from their cabins, bundled in every piece of winter clothing they owned, they could see Grady moving through his courtyard wearing nothing heavier than a wool shirt and work pants. He drank coffee in the protected space, read mail delivered by the Territorial Postal Service, and performed outdoor chores in conditions that should have required full winter gear and abbreviated exposure times. The Kowalski brothers, whose shared cabin demanded constant feeding of their stove to maintain barely tolerable interior conditions, began taking daily observations of the smoke output from Grady's chimney. Their mining backgrounds had trained them to notice efficiency patterns, and the thin, intermittent wisps from Grady's structure contrasted sharply with the thick, continuous smoke their own heating efforts produced. Stefan calculated that Grady appeared to be burning less than half the wood they consumed while maintaining obviously superior interior comfort. Olaf Henriksen, drawing on his Norwegian experience with harsh winter survival, recognized signs that his old-world knowledge should have prepared him to understand. The snow-free courtyard reminded him of sheltered farmyard spaces in Trondheim, where buildings arranged to block wind created pockets of relative warmth that extended the useful outdoor working season. His initial dismissal of Grady's design began giving way to professional curiosity about techniques that might actually surpass Scandinavian winter building methods. Sam Torres, whose professional reputation rested on understanding construction performance, found himself making regular excuses to ride past Grady's property. The carpenter's trained eye could see that something fundamental was working differently in that U-shaped structure. The building wasn't just surviving Wyoming's early winter, it appeared to be thriving in conditions that stressed every other homestead in the territory. Torres began questioning his own assumptions about optimal design for high plains conditions. The technical measurements that winter would have revealed the full scope of Grady's achievement. While outside ambient temperatures dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, his courtyard maintained an average temperature of 28 degrees, a differential that transformed brutal outdoor conditions into manageable working environment. Interior temperatures held steady at 65 degrees, with heating systems that operated perhaps 3 hours daily, compared to neighbors who burned wood continuously to achieve interior temperatures of 48 degrees. Wind speed readings would have shown the dramatic effectiveness of Grady's wind shadow design, while exposed areas of his property experienced the same 25-mile-per-hour average winds that punished every other homestead. Conditions within the protected courtyard dropped to 3 to 5 miles per hour, barely enough air movement to stir loose snow or create noticeable wind chill effects. The fuel consumption differences became the most compelling evidence of superior design performance. Morrison's cabin, built to conventional territorial standards, required constant feeding of a stove that consumed cordwood at rates that threatened his winter fuel supply. The Kowalski brothers found themselves burning through their carefully calculated timber reserves faster than anticipated, forced to supplement with scrap lumber and even furniture during particularly cold spells. Henriksen's Norwegian-influenced modifications helped somewhat, but his fuel consumption still far exceeded Grady's minimal wood use. Most remarkably, Grady's courtyard temperature never dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, even on the coldest nights of early winter. This meant that critical outdoor tasks like feeding livestock, maintaining equipment, and accessing stored supplies could be performed in conditions that approached indoor comfort levels, rather than the life-threatening exposure that characterized similar work at neighboring homesteads. January 15, 1884, marked the beginning of what the Weather Bureau in Cheyenne would document as the most severe winter weather system to strike Wyoming territory since record-keeping began. The Arctic mass that descended from the Canadian plains brought temperatures that plummeted to 35 degrees below zero, sustained by relentless winds exceeding 40 miles per hour. These conditions created wind chill factors approaching 80 degrees below zero, atmospheric violence that transformed the high plains into a landscape where exposed human flesh could freeze solid within minutes. The Weather Bureau's instruments recorded the descent with scientific precision, but no measurement could capture the terror that gripped homesteaders as their hastily built cabins began failing under assault from conditions that exceeded every survival calculation made during construction. What settlers had anticipated as merely harsh winter weather revealed itself as a prolonged siege against human habitation, testing every building decision made during the previous autumn's frantic construction season. Bill Morrison's cabin, built according to standard territorial guidelines with 6-inch log walls and conventional fireplace placement, began losing its battle against the killing cold within hours of the temperature drop. Despite burning wood 18 hours daily, feeding his stove with every scrap of fuel he could safely burn indoors, Morrison watched his interior temperature plummet to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The single-wall construction that had seemed adequate during December's milder conditions proved catastrophically insufficient when confronted with the Arctic blast that now dominated Wyoming's weather. Morrison's wife wrapped their children in every blanket the family owned, while he burned through their carefully rationed winter wood supply at 3 times the anticipated rate. The stove glowed red hot, consuming cordwood faster than the cabin could retain the heat it produced. Ice began forming on interior surfaces near the windows, and breath became visible inside their living space as the building's thermal envelope collapsed under the sustained assault of wind and cold. The Henriksen cabin, built with some Norwegian-influenced modifications that had initially seemed like old-world overthinking, fared little better than its purely American counterparts. Olaf Henriksen discovered ice forming on interior walls 3 feet from his fireplace, despite his Scandinavian understanding of winter construction. His family abandoned their bedrooms entirely, moving mattresses into the kitchen where they could sleep pressed against the stove. Even this desperate measure barely maintained survivable conditions, as the cabin's heat production fell far short of its heat loss through walls, windows, and chinking gaps that had seemed insignificant during milder weather. The Kowalski brothers faced the most dire situation among Grady's immediate neighbors. Their shared cabin, built with industrial efficiency, learned in Pennsylvania mining camps, had been designed for economy rather than thermal performance. By January 20th, interior temperatures in their structure dropped below freezing, despite continuous heating efforts that consumed their entire winter fuel allocation within 5 days. Stefan and Joseph made the desperate decision to abandon their cabin entirely, cramming their essential belongings into a single room where they could combine their heating resources and body warmth in a last-ditch survival strategy. Throughout the territory, the pattern repeated with deadly consistency. Cabins built to conventional frontier standards simply could not generate heat faster than they lost it through inadequate insulation and poor thermal design. Homesteaders burned furniture, books, and anything combustible to supplement dwindling wood supplies. Some families huddled together in single rooms, abandoning the rest of their cabins to the cold. Others made desperate attempts to improve insulation by hanging blankets against interior walls or stuffing newspaper into chinking gaps. But these emergency measures proved inadequate against the sustained brutality of the Arctic siege. Against this backdrop of systematic failure, John Grady's U-shaped fortress continued functioning as though operating under entirely different physical laws. While his neighbors struggled to maintain interior temperatures above freezing, Grady's cabin held steady between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit with heating systems that operated only 2 to 3 hours daily. The contrast became so stark that some neighbors began to suspect Grady possessed some undisclosed fuel source or heating method that he was concealing from the community. The physics behind Grady's success operated through multiple reinforcing mechanisms that conventional cabin design completely ignored. His wind shadow effect reduced exterior air movement by 75% within the protected courtyard, eliminating the convective heat loss that stripped warmth from neighboring structures. The U-shaped solar gain amplification concentrated and reflected available sunlight, even the weak winter sunshine that penetrated Wyoming's frequent cloud cover. The 18 tons of sandstone lining his interior walls stored thermal energy during any period of solar exposure, releasing this heat slowly through the long, frigid nights when no external energy input was available. Most critically, the enclosed design prevented heat loss through air movement, the invisible enemy that defeated every conventional cabin in the territory. While neighbors' structures leaked heated air through countless gaps and replaced it with Arctic outside air that required enormous fuel consumption to warm, Grady's design trapped heated air within the protected envelope and prevented the convection currents that robbed thermal energy from standard frontier construction. The measurable performance differences became extreme during the crisis period. While exterior temperatures held at 42 degrees below zero, Grady's courtyard temperature never dropped below 8 degrees above zero, a differential of 50 degrees created purely through intelligent design and strategic construction. His interior spaces maintained comfortable living temperatures that allowed normal activity and clothing, while neighbors wore full winter gear inside their failing shelters. January 28th brought the coldest night on record, with official temperatures reaching 42 degrees below zero and sustained winds of 45 miles per hour. These conditions created an environment where standard frontier construction reached its absolute breaking point. Morrison's family faced genuine hypothermia as their stove could no longer heat their cabin faster than the structure lost warmth to the exterior environment. The Kowalski brothers burned furniture and personal belongings in a desperate attempt to maintain survivable interior conditions, knowing that their fuel supplies had already been exhausted and that sunrise might find them frozen in their shared refuge. Wood consumption throughout the territory reached crisis levels, with families burning 3 to 4 times their normal winter heating requirements, while achieving interior temperatures that barely sustained life. The conventional wisdom that had guided frontier construction, build quickly, build cheaply, trust proven methods, revealed itself as dangerously inadequate when confronted with weather that exceeded the parameters of previous experience. January the 29th, 1884, 3 o'clock in the morning. Bill Morrison's desperate pounding on John Grady's door carried the urgency of a man watching his family die. Morrison stood in the howling wind with his wife and 2 children, all showing the telltale signs of hypothermia, violent shivering, confused speech, and the gray pallor that marked the final stages before unconsciousness. Their cabin stove had consumed the last scraps of burnable material hours earlier, and the interior temperature had dropped below 20 degrees despite Morrison's frantic efforts to maintain heat. With no fuel remaining and exterior conditions too dangerous for wood gathering, the Morrison family faced death before sunrise unless they found immediate shelter. Grady opened his door to reveal what seemed impossible under the circumstances. He stood wearing a light wool shirt, no heavy furs or layered winter clothing that his desperate visitors had expected. More shocking still, the view through his open door showed the courtyard beyond, where conditions appeared not merely survivable, but actually comfortable. The protected space, lit by lantern light, showed no accumulation of the driving snow that had buried paths and landmarks throughout the territory. The temperature differential was so dramatic that Morrison's children, who had been shivering violently just moments before, stopped their convulsive shaking within minutes of stepping into the wind-sheltered environment. The thermal sanctuary that Grady's design had created defied every assumption about winter survival that frontier experience had taught the Morrison family. The courtyard, completely enclosed on three sides by 18-inch walls, maintained temperatures that felt almost tropical compared to the killing conditions just 20 feet away. While exterior thermometers read 30 degrees below zero with 45-mile-per-hour winds, the protected space within Grady's U-shaped walls registered 15 degrees above zero with virtually no air movement. The 50-degree differential created a microclimate where children could function normally despite wearing only the indoor clothing they had grabbed during their emergency evacuation. Word of the Morrison family's rescue spread through the survival networks that connected homesteads during crisis periods. Desperate neighbors, facing their own heating failures and dwindling fuel supplies, began making dangerous nighttime journeys to reach Grady's compound. The Kowalski brothers arrived on January 30th, having abandoned their frozen cabin entirely when interior temperatures dropped below zero despite burning personal possessions for fuel. Olaf Henriksen brought his wife and infant son through the L. Blizzard after ice began forming on their baby's crib despite their kitchen stove glowing red hot with continuous feeding. By January 31st, Grady's U-shaped cabin sheltered 14 people from 4 families, transforming from a single homestead into a communal refuge that demonstrated the true scale of conventional construction's failure. The courtyard became a shared living space where activities continued that should have been impossible during Wyoming's worst recorded winter. Children played outside games while exterior conditions registered life-threatening extremes. Adults performed maintenance tasks, prepared meals, and held conversations in an outdoor environment that felt comfortable enough for extended occupation. The social dynamics of this emergency shelter revealed how completely Grady's design had solved problems that defeated standard frontier construction. Families that had been trapped in single-room survival situations for weeks suddenly found themselves with adequate space for normal winter activities. The protected courtyard provided 500 square feet of usable outdoor space where laundry could be hung, tools maintained, and livestock tended without the extreme gear and abbreviated exposure times that characterize similar work at conventional homesteads. For the first time since construction, Grady shared the technical principles that his neighbors had dismissed as theoretical nonsense during the building season. Speaking to his gathered refugees around a courtyard fire that burned comfortably in open air while blizzard winds raged beyond the protective walls, Grady explained the physics behind their salvation in terms that practical frontier minds could finally understand. "The shape catches wind like a sail catches air," he told them, but backwards, creating still space instead of movement. Wind hits these walls and flows around the opening instead of through it, leaving quiet air that stays warm. He pointed to the sandstone lining that had seemed like expensive ornamentation during construction. Stone walls drink up sunshine during the day, give it back at night like a wood stove that never goes cold. Even weak winter sun, when you catch it right and hold it in mass that stores heat. The demonstration of thermal mass principles became visceral for families who had struggled with heating systems that consumed enormous fuel quantities while producing inadequate warmth. Grady showed them how the 18 tons of sandstone absorbed solar energy during brief periods when winter sunshine penetrated cloud cover, then released this stored heat gradually through the frigid nights. The thermal mass effect meant that heating requirements could be met with minimal fuel input because the building itself functioned as a massive battery that captured and stored available energy for slow release when external conditions offered no heat source. The wind shadow effect that protected the courtyard became equally clear through direct experience. Refugees who had struggled against Wyoming's relentless winter winds discovered they could work outside in shirt sleeves within the protected space while listening to 40-mile-per-hour gusts howling just beyond the barrier walls. "Cold air's heavy," Grady explained. "Shape the space right, and it flows around you instead of through you. These walls don't just block wind, they redirect it away from the space where people need to live and work. The measurable performance of Grady's design during the crisis period provided irrefutable evidence of superior technique. While neighbors' cabins consumed 3 to 4 times normal fuel loads while achieving interior temperatures that barely sustained life, Grady's system maintained comfortable living conditions for 14 people with 60% less fuel consumption than a single conventional cabin would have required for a family of 4. The courtyard allowed outdoor work at ambient temperatures of 30 degrees below zero, conditions that would have killed exposed humans within minutes at conventional homesteads. February 3rd brought the weather break that ended Wyoming's siege winter. As exterior temperatures climbed toward survivable ranges and wind speeds dropped below life-threatening levels, the refugees who had sheltered in Grady's fortress began assessing the damage to conventional construction throughout the territory. The final tally revealed the catastrophic failure of standard frontier building techniques when confronted with conditions that exceeded historical precedent. 7 families within a 20-mile radius had suffered severe cold injuries, including frostbite requiring amputation. 2 deaths from hypothermia were recorded in Albany County alone, both in cabins built to conventional territorial standards. Against this backdrop of systematic failure and human tragedy, Grady's compound had protected 14 people with 0 injuries and living conditions that remained comfortable throughout the crisis period. The contrast between survival and catastrophe had been determined entirely by construction techniques. The difference between building with traditional knowledge that understood environmental extremes and frontier expedients that prioritized speed over performance when nature tested human habitation to its limits. February brought Wyoming's grudging release from winter's grip, and with the thaw came a quiet reckoning that spread through Albany County's homesteading community without fanfare or formal acknowledgement. John Grady made no speeches about vindication, offered no criticism of the conventional wisdom that had nearly killed his neighbors, and demonstrated no satisfaction at having been proven correct. Instead, he simply helped families assess damage to their failed cabins and began sharing construction knowledge with the understated generosity of a man who understood that survival trumped pride in frontier communities. Bill Morrison approached Grady in early March with the humility of someone whose family owed their lives to techniques he had openly mocked 6 months earlier. Morrison's cabin required complete reconstruction after its thermal failure during the crisis period, and he requested detailed advice for incorporating passive solar principles into his rebuilding project. The conversation took place in Grady's courtyard, where Morrison could experience firsthand the microclimate effects that had seemed impossible during construction, but had proven life-saving during the emergency. Grady provided measurements, orientation specifications, and material calculations with the same methodical precision he had applied to his own building, treating Morrison's request as a natural extension of neighborly cooperation rather than an opportunity for superiority. The Kowalski brothers, whose industrial backgrounds had initially led them to dismiss Grady's approach as wasteful, made their own pilgrimage to request construction specifications. Stephen and Joseph brought surveying equipment and notebooks, treating Grady's design as an engineering problem they needed to solve for their own rebuilding project. Their mining experience with efficiency calculations had taught them to recognize superior performance when survival data proved it conclusively, and they documented Grady's techniques with the thoroughness of men who intended to replicate rather than merely understand his methods. Olaf Henriksen's response reflected the complex relationship between Old World knowledge and New World applications that characterized much of frontier innovation. His Norwegian background included exposure to courtyard designs and thermal mass principles, but he had never seen these techniques applied to the specific challenges of high plains construction. Henriksen recognized in Grady's work a synthesis of traditional knowledge and environmental adaptation that exceeded purely American or purely European approaches to extreme climate construction. His endorsement carried particular weight within the immigrant community, where Old World building experience provided credibility that frontier improvisation often lacked. Spring 1884 brought a revolution in Albany County construction practices that occurred without proclamation or official recognition, but transformed how homesteaders approached shelter building. 8 homesteads incorporated U-shaped or L-shaped courtyards into their reconstruction or new building projects, adapting Grady's principles to their specific sites and needs. The variations demonstrated how solid technique could be modified without losing effectiveness, as each builder adjusted orientation, dimensions, and materials while maintaining the core elements of wind shadow creation and thermal mass utilization. Sam Torres, whose professional reputation had initially led him to dismiss Grady's design as unnecessarily complex, began offering Grady-style construction services to clients who requested passive solar features. Torres's adoption of the technique provided crucial legitimacy within the broader territorial construction community, where professional endorsement carried more weight than individual success stories. His detailed cost analyses demonstrated that the additional material investment required for double wall construction and thermal mass installation paid for itself through reduced fuel consumption within 2 heating seasons, making the approach economically sound as well as technically superior. The territorial building inspector, conducting routine assessments of Albany County construction quality, documented Grady's design for official recommendations that would influence building standards throughout Wyoming territory. The inspector's report, filed with the territorial government in Cheyenne, contained detailed measurements and performance data that provided the first formal recognition of passive solar principles in frontier construction guidelines. The document noted courtyard microclimate effects of 20 to 25 degrees temperature increase over ambient conditions, fuel efficiency improvements of 65% compared to conventional construction, and comfort zone expansion that effectively added 500 square feet of usable outdoor space even during severe weather. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, alerted to Grady's techniques through their existing documentation of his New Mexico service, requested comprehensive reports for potential application in frontier fort construction. Military interest in passive heating and cooling techniques reflected broader recognition that traditional knowledge often provided solutions superior to standard engineering approaches when applied to extreme environmental conditions. The Army's technical analysis confirmed Grady's measurements and began incorporating passive solar principles into cold weather construction manuals used at installations throughout the Western Territories. By 1885, Wyoming Territory's official settlement guidelines recommended courtyard designs for homesteads in high-altitude locations where severe winter conditions exceeded the performance capabilities of conventional rectangular construction. These recommendations represented the first institutional recognition of passive solar heating principles in American frontier policy, establishing techniques that had been dismissed as primitive experimentation just 2 years earlier as preferred practice for territorial development. The influence spread beyond government policy into commercial and institutional construction. Cheyenne architect Henry Morrison incorporated passive solar principles into commercial buildings designed for Wyoming's territorial capital, creating structures that demonstrated superior performance in urban as well as rural applications. The University of Wyoming's agricultural extension program began, developing educational materials on courtyard construction, recognizing that building techniques could be taught and improved rather than simply passed down through trial and error experience. The 1889 Wyoming statehood documents cited passive solar design principles in official settlement recommendations, establishing Grady's techniques as part of the state's institutional knowledge for territorial development. This formal recognition marked the transformation of experimental building methods into established practice, demonstrating how individual innovation could influence regional construction standards when validated by measurable performance results. The Civilian Conservation Corps, documenting frontier architecture during the 1930s, recognized Grady's original cabin as innovative frontier architecture that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics and environmental adaptation. The National Register of Historic Places listing in 1976 acknowledged the site as pioneering passive solar design that influenced residential construction techniques still used in modern sustainable building. John Grady's U-shaped cabin served his family for 34 years, surviving every Wyoming winter while maintaining fuel consumption rates 70% lower than conventional territorial construction. When the structure was finally demolished in 1918, the sandstone thermal mass walls showed no frost damage after 35 years of extreme weather cycles, testament to construction principles that worked with natural heating and cooling processes rather than fighting them. The lesson that emerged from Grady's quiet success resonated through generations of builders who learned that survival often depended on understanding environmental forces rather than simply resisting them.